I put the link in the chat, so now everyone can see it. It's kind of weird. It's Inception-y because I can see on the live stream me sending the link. You should be able to see, um, like the WebEx link. Like it should just be streaming my monitor, which basically, yeah. Here, I'll even turn on my camera so then you can see my face. So then I'll like, hmm. Okay, okay, cool. Yes, the Zoom, or no, sorry, not the Zoom. The WebEx meeting is currently being recorded, um, and by Kevin, and then it looks like I think you're also recording it. Maybe I don't remember if that's the record icon or not. Um, yes. So, well, it'll be recorded for up to 4 hours. I'll probably stop the stream for the lunch break briefly and then start it up again just because I believe you're capped at 4 hours or maybe it's 6. I can't remember exactly how many. But if it's beyond a certain number of continuous streaming hours, it will not be archived on the channel. Well, good thing I was double checking things because I had muted my desktop audio, so you would have just heard my microphone and not anyone else's.
Right, that's why we gotta. Oh, I always have to try these things out in advance, right?
Yep. Always got to make sure everything's running smoothly.
Eric, I've got to go check on something real quick. So you're gonna, if there's anybody else that pops into the waiting room, um, go ahead and admit them.
Sure thing.
And then if you see any, as co-host, if you see any presenters come on, go ahead and in the participants, you can hover over their name, click on more, and make them a co-host because that'll give them permission to share screens,
Okie dokie.
which they might need.
Oh, Kevin, since I think I saw you were back, I don't think I actually have the opportunity to make people co-host. When I click on more, I do not have that option. I don't know if that's just the host can make co-hosts and other co-hosts can't. Sort of like you can't have the deputy deputize other people. I don't know. All right.
Do we have any other presenters on here that need access to share a screen?
Yes, Kevin, I will.
You already are a co-host and should have access to share screen.
All right, thanks.
Kevin, just so you know, I think you stepped out before I told you. I don't have actually the option as a co-host to make other co-hosts. I think that's just something you can do. At least it's not showing up as an option for me when I right-click on people on the More option.
There's Jen.
Oh, and I guess this goes for anyone who's already on here and joining. In the chat, there should be a link to the live stream on the OAC's YouTube channel. Since I cannot hear, I guess, myself on it and what the audio quality sounds like, because then I would get a feedback loop. If anyone wants to check that out and let me know how the audio sounds, like if it sounds distant, if it sounds bad or anything like that, I can't really do sort of quality control for the live stream audio right now, since I'm in the Zoom call, but then also live streaming. I'd get a feedback loop and it would sound weird. So check that out if you want to see that as well, and share it with anyone you think wants to tune in and watch along. Although I guess technically this Zoom meeting is also public, but just thought I'd let everyone know as well.
Eric, you might need to put it in the chat again for folks that weren't, I don't think it shows up for people that came in after you put it there.
Ah, okay. Well, it has been posted again. All right. Well, it is 9:30, so I'm gonna get started with some introductory remarks here, unless Kevin has important introductory remarks that he would like to say before me.
No, this is your show.
Oh boy, my circus, my monkeys. All right. So the first thing I need to get established is that if you are not presenting, I kindly ask that you mute and also turn off your camera when not presenting or asking questions. And that's mostly for my sake, selfish reasons. Since I am live streaming this on the OAC's YouTube channel, it's all of your cameras being on and mics being on actively affects my bit rate that uploads to the YouTube live stream. So it can affect the quality of the stream, and it can also affect the quality of recording. And it might benefit you if you're having any issues with latency, or it's pixelated or laggy or anything like that. So when not presenting, I kindly ask that you mute yourself and turn off your camera if possible. Not that I don't want to see everyone's lovely faces. I mean, that is an important component, but during lunch, you'll have the opportunity to sort of, talk with one another in a more casual setting when not presenting. All right, and then we've got confirmation from the YouTube live stream that the audio is good, so thank you, Aaron. So we've got a lot of things to cover today. We've got we're going to start things off with a panel discussion, and then we've got several presenters afterwards. If you have not checked the news page of the OAC, it should be the second to latest version of the news. I can also post a link in the chat, which I will do right now. And that has the outline for today's presentations and schedule, so I recommend checking that out. It's got a couple poster abstracts, so we're trying something a little bit different today as well. During our lunch break, we will be doing a virtual poster session. So there are links provided in the link I just sent to a Padlet site, which is basically a virtual sort of bulletin board where you can virtually pin up your posters. So there's a couple posters that you can check out as well. Feel free to check them out whenever, but during lunch is when I allocated time for the poster presenters to sort of answer questions and talk about their poster presentations. And then the business meeting today at 1:30 will be on WebEx, and that will be for members only. That one will not be recorded and open to the public, so just a word of caution to those who are maybe not OAC members. You won't have access to the WebEx business meeting, but otherwise everything else will be recorded and either edited or uploaded to YouTube or technically, since this is a YouTube live stream, it is already going to be archived on our YouTube channel that you can watch later at any date. So those are just some basic housekeeping things to keep in mind. I see that all of our panelists are now here for our first presentation. It is a panel discussion with moderated by Al Tonetti, with panelists Kevin Nolan, Jared Burks, and Thomas Grooms. And the topic is geophysics as a viable tool in Phase 1 archaeological investigations, bringing Ohio archaeology into the 21st century. So with all of those little housekeeping things out of the way, I guess before we start, before we let the panel go on their discussion, I want to open this up to questions anyone might have, technical or otherwise, just because I want to catch them now before they become issues later. If anyone's having issues with the live stream, with the Zoom link, any other questions about netiquette, that kind of things. Sorry, this is the educator in me coming out. It's finals week, so I gotta get that mode turned off. But any questions that anyone have about technical issues?
So, Eric, this is Al. So I'm not going to be able to share my screen.
You should be able to share your screen because
Okay.
you are a co-host.
All right, thank you.
So if you actually, if you want to see what my screen looks like, you can go to the YouTube live stream right now. But at the bottom of your screen, and this goes for all presenters as well, just a little primer on how this is going to work on Zoom. At the bottom of your screen, you're going to see, your mute and your stop video options on the bottom left. And this is when you hover at the bottom with your mouse. You're going to see security, then you're going to see participants. You're going to see chat to open up the chat. And then there's in the middle with a green logo, it's sort of a lime green, it's going to say share screen. And then there's also a little caret arrow next to that share screen, which should give you a little advanced sharing options if you need them. Now, if you click share screen, you're going to have, if you have multiple monitors, it's going to ask you which monitors you want to share. It's going to also ask you for all of your applications that are open. So, and obviously, if you're not a presenter, this might be not useful information, but if you've never heard it, could also be useful information as well. So, for example, on my screen, I have two Google Chrome browsers open. I have my streaming platform open. I have a separate messaging app open, and then I have just my two monitors. So those are all the applications I have open right now. So I could either choose to just share the app. So if you have PowerPoint open, you can just share PowerPoint. If you want to just share everything on your screen, you can share everything on your screen. But the danger of that is if you have email that has sensitive information and you switch between them, then we might accidentally see your email. So I just thought I'd let you know that. And that's how you share a screen. So hopefully that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Al?
Yes, I think.
Excellent. Any other technical questions that I can try to answer now before we get started on things? Hearing none, then we're going to get rolling. Just to reiterate, this is a panel discussion moderated by Al Tonetti with panelists Kevin Nolan, Jared Burks, and Thomas Grooms, titled Geophysics as a Valuable Tool in Phase 1 Archaeological Investigations, Bringing Ohio Archaeology into the 21st Century. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Al and let the discussion commence.
And can you see my screen now?
I cannot.
Okay.
So if you go to the bottom center, like I was saying, there should be a share icon. Actually, let me see if I can't highlight it.
Yeah, but now I got my screen up and I can't.
Oh man, you can't copy and paste clipped images to the screen. So you might have to navigate
something
out
you
of.
Can you email it to me and I can share it?
It's not really that necessary.
Okay.
It's just a few slides. That's all right. We'll just go back here and I'll just begin. All right. So yes, this panel discussion will examine the efficacy of using archaeological geophysics in Phase 1 field investigations to identify archaeological sites eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. These are called historic properties. The primary question explored is under what circumstances and regulatory processes is magnetic or gradiometry and or other geophysical instrumentation a phase 1 survey best practice for complying with the standard of making a reasonable and good faith effort to identify historic properties, archaeological in nature? I want to give each panelist an opportunity to make an opening statement, and then we can discuss the main and any related questions. But first, what makes an archaeological site eligible for the National Register? The answer is when it has yielded, or may be likely to yield, information important in prehistory or history. We don't have very much time to get into what is and is not important information here. And I know Kevin has a lot to say about it and proposes we think about importance or significance differently than we're perhaps used to. But I'd ask that we don't get too far into those weeds this morning and focus more on the efficacy of using geophysics to identify National Register sites during phase 1 surveys. That said, I think it's obvious that over the last 50 years or so, this important information has most often been retrieved from and among what we traditionally recognize as archaeological features, places of non-portable, in-ground, and relatively undisturbed evidence of human behavior. I think the quest for features remains the most reasonable target for identifying National Register eligible sites, even at the phase 1 level, and not so much in the scatters of artifacts found on the ground surface or retrieved from the excavation of shovel test pits, the two dominant methods of site identification used in the latter half of the 20th century and into the first 2 decades of this century. I know I'm simplifying a more complex matter, but I venture to say that very few sites in Ohio have been or will be in the near future determined eligible based on only artifacts collected from the ground surface or the plow zone. If the goal of identification is to find places likely or places containing or likely to contain important information, often represented by and in features and their relationships to each other, why do we continue to often use methodologies that are very unlikely to identify such features when the means exist to find such features without often expensive and ineffective and sometimes questionable and objectionable, at least to some Indian tribes, surface collecting, shovel test pitting, unit excavating, and plow zone stripping? Is it because most qualified archaeologists, and I use qualified in air quotes, are not trained to use geophysical instruments and process and interpret the data, or that the instruments are expensive to acquire or rent, or that we are stuck in our ways and resistant to change, or that federal agencies and SHPOs continue to accept identification efforts without efficacious geophysical investigations, or a combination of these? Do we need to explore ways to effect meaningful change regarding this matter? I want to take a few more minutes to address the reasonable and good faith standards as defined by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. That's the federal agency that ensures federal agencies comply with Section 106 regs and used by the SHPO in its reviews of archaeological investigations. Although federal agencies are legally required to fulfill the requirements of Section 106, they often have applicants for federal assistance through their archaeological consultants conduct these investigations, which must meet the ACHP standards, including making a reasonable good faith effort prior to approving projects called undertakings. According to the Advisory Council, a reasonable effort to identify historic properties is attained by, among other things, considering past planning, research, and studies, the likely nature and location of historic properties, applicable professional and state standards and guidelines, and when it is logically designed to identify eligible properties without being excessive or inadequate, considering methodologies used in other historic property surveys in the area that have been effective in terms of time and cost. A related question we may want to address, assuming the State Historic Preservation Office publishes its own guidelines addressing the use of geophysical surveys in archaeological investigations, is should the OAC issue its own professional guidelines or a statement about their use so we can refer to it when participating as a consulting party on federal or state projects? There is a history of the OAC doing so. until the SHPO published its 1994 archaeology guidelines, which I was intimately involved with when I worked there. SHPO used the OAC's 1979 specifications for reports of archaeological services as the standard. These specifications were also used to establish the current but very much outdated procedures for conducting archaeological investigations on public lands and archaeological preserves pursuant to Ohio Administrative Code 149-1-02, which became effective in 1983. Revising those procedures is a discussion we should soon have. As a caveat, the Advisory Council's regulations do not give SHPO approval authority over the identification methods used, but SHPO can greatly influence and, dare I say, insist how identification is conducted, especially since it has issued its own archaeology guidelines. Nor do the regulations require the identification of all eligible sites before the federal agency approves a project. The regulations contain a post-review or unanticipated discovery provision. Now, although that provision is necessary and understandable given the nature of archaeological sites, I think we all know that once project ground disturbance begins, the discovery of previously undetected sites is problematic at best. The intent of the regulations is clear. Identification of all eligible sites should be done in all areas directly impacted by the project prior to approval and construction begins. Now, according to the Advisory Council, a good faith effort is achieved when, among other things, the identification effort is conducted in consultation with any Indian tribe that might attach religious and cultural significance to historic properties that may be present, and the State Historic Preservation Office, who represents the interest of the state and its citizens, including the OAC, is carried out by qualified persons who have demonstrated familiarity with the range of potential historic properties that may be encountered and their characteristics, is fully supported by adequate funding and other necessary resources, and is not compromised by lack of integrity or omission, such as manipulating or ignoring evidence. So that's my statement. Here we are, ready to develop a phase 1 scope of work for a project to take the steps necessary to identify historic properties in consultation with the SHPO and Indian tribes. The question is, how early and when in the process is it appropriate to use archaeological geophysics? So let's begin the conversation. Kevin, Jared, or Thomas, if you have any opening statements, chime in and we'll get the conversation started.
This is Thomas Grooms. I'm the archaeological transportation reviews manager at the SHPO. I've been there for over 20 some years, and yeah, I mean, I'm currently the one working on the guidelines, the archaeological guidelines that we're hoping to have out this summer, or at least a draft for some review and comments. Yeah, I mean, SHPO is excited about the use of geophysical at phase 1 level. I mean, a cursory look at our NADB database shows something like, I don't know, 62 CRM reports with the geophysical in the title. And just taking a quick look at those, it seems like, I mean, we've been using geophysical mainly for, say, at the beginning of a phase 2. So we've already done our traditional identification and we're moving on to a phase 2. And that's usually the first thing done, especially in the last 5-10 years. And then, of course, when we know that there's possible cemeteries or internments in the project area, we definitely have been using geophysical surveys for years on that. I was going to give my best example that I have in that, and Jared knows this well, and many others, the Eastern Corridor project. This is what's touching, Al's touched upon many aspects of this. It's a large, for those who might not be familiar with it, a large multimodal highway and rail project in Hamilton and Claremont counties. basically taking 32, bypassing Newtown, and going through some of our most archaeologically sensitive area in southern Ohio for sure, if not the state. Many known sites. ODOT knew this going in, that this was going to be a monumental task to get over this, if this thing would ever get built. So they undertook one of the larger geophysical surveys at that time, at least over 100 acres, 110 plus acres. And they did this over traditional methods because, again, we knew that there was going to be archaeological sites. There's sites there. The deposits are complex, dense, and the biggest factor, and our consultation with the tribes, was that, you know, there's going to be burials. We know there are going to be burials. So it wasn't necessarily a need to go out there, dig, shovel test, collect artifacts. Pretty much everything you were going to encounter was going to be significant. It's one large archaeological district. So we just needed to, basically, for the planners of the project, to tell them our little bit, how difficult this was going to be. What a hurdle to overcome. And this is just archaeology, not to mention all the other aspects they had to deal with on the pre-planning of this project. We knew that we had some cemetery, at least one cemetery out there, historic cemetery. And I think, I think Jared identified, at least in that initial survey, 355 magnetic anomalies. And, you know, this was just one of those, long story short, you know, project died for a variety of reasons. But it's ODOT was doing their, you know, their due diligence at that time to really address, to kind of balance what was all the factors there, the consultation with the tribes, and knowing the density of archaeological sites out there. This was the best method possible. And it had become available to us. I mean, it was becoming a little bit more affordable and easier to do on a larger scale. And about, you know, 7-8 years later, it's even becoming more affordable and easier to do on a larger scale as well. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap this up, we are going to incorporate use of geophysical into the archaeological guidelines at a phase 1 level, some guidelines for that. We are still wrestling with some of the logistics behind what we would call a site at this phase 1 level, what our verification of the anomalies, because we still got to move from magnetic anomalies to cultural features. And when will that be done? So just jumping over that hurdle. And then, of course, what Al was talking about is everything with a cultural feature out there eligible, or at least, you know, significant, and needs to go on to maybe further phase 2 testing, or at least, you know, on to a phase 3 data recovery. So these are some of the things that we're wrestling with, and we're hoping we're going to get more examples of this, and so we can kind of work out some of these details.
Okay, great. Thanks, Thomas. Jared or Kevin, you want to chime in at this point?
Sure, I can go next since Kevin is muted. He's staring me down with his eye patch. I guess I would start with, yeah, what he said. So like Thomas, I've been at the game for a while, 20 years, and we've been doing geophysical surveys that long. And the reason I started doing geophysical surveys, and the reason we bought a magnetometer first, is because it works really good in Ohio to find a lot of the kinds of archaeology that we're interested in finding, and that ultimately becomes, quote unquote, significant in this Section 106 process. and other processes. When we first started doing it, we had a handheld, one probe magnetometer, and we could do 1 acre a day. So when you look out across Ohio, and especially like that Eastern Corridor project that Thomas talked about, which by the way was 200 acres, not 100 acres.
Yeah, I didn't check the other.
Yeah, it actually spanned 2 seasons.
I'm limited in my reports that I have available.
Yeah, and it was, well, unfortunately, it's burned into my brain. And when we started, we could do 1 acre a day at the data density necessary to detect the kinds of features that are pretty common on Ohio archaeology sites. And while I would have loved to have used it on every phase 1 project at that point, 20 years ago, or even before, it just wasn't practical. It wasn't economical, wasn't cost effective. And there were other useful tools for locating archaeology sites, the kinds of things we needed to assess to determine, if anything significant was within a project area. So while I might have talked about using it on phase 1 projects, we just couldn't do it. It cost too much money. As I think probably both Al and Thomas mentioned, now that's changed. Fast forward 15, 20 years, and darn those Germans for bringing that giant magnetometer system over to survey at Hopewell Cultural National Historical Park. But they demonstrated to us that, and we were already moving in this direction, but we just hadn't quite gotten there yet, that, hey, look, you can survey 50 acres a day with the magnetometer and get the same results, basically, that you got with the handheld magnetometer that you worked very careful at collecting the data. So in the right context, which is basically an open field, and view of those satellites up above, because that's what makes this TOAD system work so effectively. You can find those kinds of things, in particular pit features, especially earth ovens, that we are often looking for on Section 106 projects. We often aren't looking for them until the phase 2 stage, but it seems, historically speaking, the trajectory of our research ends up moving toward finding those things below surface in an attempt to demonstrate some kind of site integrity. Does the site have good enough preservation to provide the details needed to make a site significant, answering questions. So we're looking for those features, and hey, we can do that now. Like, one person can drive that thing around at 15 kilometers an hour, or however fast we were going, and find this stuff pretty quick. So it's a brave new world, man and woman. And I think it's me personally, I'm not advocating that we give up every other approach, because this would be another piece of kit in our toolkit that we can use to achieve a similar sort of goal, and that is locate archaeological resources, cultural resources that we need to assess. Will it be better than, say, shovel testing or surface collection? Well, we don't know yet, and we don't know what better means exactly, but it certainly will be better at finding archaeological features beneath the surface than shovel testing and surface collection, primarily because those two techniques were never developed to do that. That's not the reason we use those techniques. So we will definitely end up with a lot fewer artifacts at the end of a magnetic survey at the phase 1 level, but we're not necessarily advocating that we don't also employ some kind of surface investigation. But I'm looking forward to trying to see how we can make this work at a phase 1 level.
Great, thanks, Jared. Kevin?
Yeah, I'm in favor of building additional tools into our phase 1 identification toolkit, including geophysics. Since Al has asked me not to, I won't go into what other tools I think are appropriate. But we've known for a long time that the methods that are standard in phase one assessments are not really adequate. There are lots of methodological papers out there and have been out there as long as the CRM industry has been a thing. And so we've known that these are not adequate to identify the kinds of things that we're looking for. We know quantitatively and qualitatively what the issues are. But we keep using them. So we need to find new tools. And now that remote sensing is becoming much more affordable, you've got those multi-channel carts that you can tow and push the multi-sensor probes across the field. And so we have that opportunity to look at that. The one thing I think that I would add, instead of repeating the same things that Thomas and Jared have already said, is that there are ways also to evaluate what we're doing quantitatively to see if we are getting at the kinds of things that we want. And so there are, and Al told me not to get into the details on this, but I would argue and have argued that applying information theory concepts, we can quantitatively assess whether or not we are learning what we can from deposits with the tools that we're using. And so we can evaluate how much information and data we can extract with different levels of investment in each of the different kinds of techniques: shovel testing, pedestrian survey, geophysics, geochemistry, whatever tools we have, and we can measure how much more information we get with different kinds of things and which ones aren't getting us the kinds of information that we need. And so the other thing that I would also comment on, and slight disagreement to what Al was saying, is that I am very much against the over-reliance on criteria D as the archaeology criteria. Archaeological sites are eligible under all of the other criteria. And so we need to be using those, and we can't just keep saying, well, it has information potential because there's features. That's not information potential. And so if you want to go out there and you want to dig up those features, you need to have, in my view, a much better reason than there are artifacts there that we will have to curate in perpetuity. So that's my opening salvo, I guess.
Okay, I'm just scanning through the chat right now, and there's a question: is having the open field setting essentially the key for phase one surveys? Look for these settings when available and choose other options when not. I guess it's referred to geophysical surveys. You know, the more open the area is, I think the better it is for doing geophysics, but you can do geophysics in less open areas too. Thomas gave the illustration of, down at the, in the Eastern Corridor, and there are a lot of already known sites down in that area. But I think the question is, when you have, tens of acres of open field and it's basically a blank slate, you know nothing about it, why not do a phase one geophysical survey as the first step in the identification process? If it's open and it's accessible, why not use that? I'll pose that question out there.
I think Jared hit on it. I mean, it was time consuming and costly. Now it's not so much for certain firms. I mean, not everyone has the capability of doing that. And I do know at this point, the SHPO is not going to make this the only or the most preferred option out there. But it is going to be moving towards that direction. Just out of the economics of it and the results. The more we use this, the more companies kind of invest in it, and the better that we have the practitioners at interpreting the data. I could see this being rolled out as the preferred method on any size project. given certain conditions, the right conditions. Of course, we're going to have to wrestle with, again, significance. I mean, what is significance on this? We're going to be looking at a whole new data set right off the bat. Instead of looking at artifacts to kind of douse our way down to features, we're already starting with these anomalies that are more than likely cultural anomalies. We'll get better at identifying those cultural anomalies. And then, you know, we're starting to talk about site types that are composed of 3 or 4 features. Maybe that goes to phase 2, maybe it, or at least not features, but anomalies, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. This all is based upon the research design that's being built and what we're using, or what the PI is using for their criteria for significance. Yeah, I'll shut up and let somebody else jump in there.
Well, there's a question in the chat from Bruce Omont about saying that this is like blurring the lines between phase 1 and phase 2, and where does evaluation begin? I wanted to call that out because, I mean, in phase 1, we are evaluating. Right. We are dismissing 95% or more of the sites that we encounter at the phase 1 level. We are evaluating them, and that is a terminal evaluation. They don't ever get another chance. And so if our shovel tests missed the significant deposits, or a collector came along and removed that paleo point from that small non-diagnostic lithic scatter, and we didn't do anything else, then we have missed something. And at the phase 1 level, we have evaluated that and we've thrown it out, and we've precluded the ability to ever learn anything about it. And so using geophysics and other methods at the identification level will limit the things like that we are going to miss, and account for some of these known liabilities of the conditions that we work in now.
Right. And, you know, the question is, does it meet the reasonable standard of the advisory council if you're only doing surface collecting and shovel test pitting and you don't use geophysics over there to find features? You're right. We're writing off a lot of quote sites against air quotes, because I think the whole definition of what a site is needs to be re-examined. I think we need to be looking at landscapes, larger things than just sites. But, you know, I think the advent of geophysics kind of calls into question the way we've done things in the past, and many of us are continually doing them. And today, I just don't think it meets the reasonable standard. And, you know, I think the OAC is going to be commenting on that to agencies, that it doesn't meet the reasonable standard when we're not incorporating geophysics, whether it's, you know, the first thing you do on a identification of a historic property survey, or it's, you know, the blending of it at the phase 1 or 2, as Bruce was talking about. But yeah, okay. Jared, I think you wanted to say something.
Wow, lots of comments coming in now.
Yeah.
So it is kind of scary to think about the possibility of not doing a surface artifact survey, let's say in an open agricultural field. But having been doing that for, I don't know how many years now, 30 years, and then also then employing some magnetometry after the fact on select clusters of artifacts, and in areas where there maybe aren't as many artifacts on the surface, I can say that using artifacts as a surface artifacts as a proxy to locate features works some of the time, but it doesn't work all the time. And ultimately, we're also often using the density of artifacts on the surface to help decide what's important and what's not important. And even worse, we're almost only looking at flint debris on the surface when we're talking about pre-contact period sites. And as I think a lot of you know, as you move away from flint sources, the amount of flint debris that's on the surface decreases just by a factor of distance from flint source. Doesn't mean the sites get any more or any less important or have fewer features. There just are fewer things on the surface. So, I mean, we regularly identify fire-cracked rock because that's something that's pretty, widely used regardless of how close you are to a flint source. It takes a lot of burning to produce fire-cracked rock, and things that are burned are usually relatively easy to detect in magnetic data. So fire-cracked rock is a good proxy for knowing that somebody did something there that could still be present, beneath the plow layer. But I also want to mention that there are an awful lot of things that people did in the past, especially in Ohio, in the Middle Ohio Valley, and anywhere else they built earthworks that didn't leave any artifacts behind. Earthwork sites notoriously have very little artifactual debris at them, unless you're digging in a mound, which we don't do much of anymore, thankfully. So that's one big artifact class that we're just not seeing on phase one surveys, and it kills me every time. We do a phase one survey, and it's in a really nice area, high probability for earthwork surveys, but there's really nothing we can do about that because the only way to find them, if they're not visible in aerial photographs, is to go out there and do a magnetic survey or some other kind of remote sensing. And it just hasn't been feasible in the past. And if you think, my concern is maybe just because I like earthwork sites. Watch the next presentation or look at the last, 30, 40 years of doing geophysics on earthwork sites in Ohio, and you realize that what we know about those things is the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more of them out there on the landscape. You could troll through Google Earth right now. Stop listening to us, go look at Google Earth, and you're likely to find an undocumented earthwork site if you look, long enough. They're out there. So that's going to be a type of artifact or feature that we're going to find once we start surveying at the landscape scale. And I see some folks have been mentioning the United Kingdom and other places in Europe where phase one is geophysical survey. They don't even know what a shovel test is. They don't do it there. And they very routinely find massive earthwork kind of, archaeology that was undocumented before and maybe doesn't even show up in aerial photographs, even in those settings where lots of stuff does show up from the air. We're going to find stuff that we didn't find before, but we're also going to maybe not find those little teeny lithic scatters and those endless isolated finds out there on the landscape, one flake or one projectile point that ultimately we end up not doing anything with, at least in a Section 106 setting. So they aren't really that important to making determinations of significance, at least in 98, 99% of the cases.
Okay. One person asked in the chat, can you address the issues of accuracy, false negative and false positives in the use of remote sensing and the implications for site discovery? Anybody want to address that?
I can, since we do struggle with that a lot, and we've worked a lot over the years into trying to improve accuracy and to reduce the amount of false positives, because there are a lot of things in nature that look, let's say, magnetically like an archaeological feature. So probably from the second survey we did in a CRM setting, a magnetic survey, we do not do these magnetic surveys without also employing some kind of first level ground truthing of the anomalies, because most of our clients can only budget to dig up a few things. And if they dig up 3 rocks and the other 20 things are archaeological features of interest, then we failed in providing them with good results. So we always use coring, soil coring, to at least sample some number of anomalies and sort through things that may not be archaeological in nature. And sure, there are still natural things that look like archaeological features even in coring, but it's really, really easy to say find an earth oven while coring, at least in Ohio. And there are a lot of other kinds of archaeological features that are pretty distinctive, even in a 1-inch soil core. So I think that we can't just go out there and throw a massive geophysical survey at an area without also employing some kind of other information. It could even be other kinds of geophysical data to help evaluate, say, that magnetic data survey. And, you know, we're not far away from using ground penetrating radar on massive scales either. It is now, there are now big multi-channel systems that can be towed and driven around, and you can survey hectares a day with those things at unprecedented data densities, like a reading every 6.5 centimeters in X and Y, which is ridiculous. So evaluating results sort of during that phase 1 level is really critical to making this work. And I'm glad people are concerned about that, because that is a really big concern.
There's another question in the chat. Are there guidelines for interpreting geophysical data that OHPO can use?
Thomas?
Yeah, well, we're kind of relying on the practitioners who do that. I've been looking at a lot of other state guidelines, archaeological guidelines, and I'm not seeing a whole lot. The guidelines are intended to set some of the lowest bar standards. This is what we want the data collected, and this is how we will have it, have the data collected, and how you're going to report the data. Interpreting that, I don't see anything in anyone's guidelines on how to interpret that data. We might suggest maybe software packages, things like that, but I'm definitely going to kind of, since we have Jared here, kind of refer to Jared on some of this, help some writing some of this stuff. And if we can point to anything that helps interpret that data. But I think it's up to the person who's running the machine and running the software.
Yeah, so we're not reinventing the wheel here. There are guidelines, like really good guidelines for places like the UK, where they routinely use this stuff in a kind of a CRM setting. Now, their guidelines are going to be different than our guidelines, obviously, because they're looking for different kinds of archaeology than we are. We don't have Roman villas in Ohio, alas. Most of our archaeology is more subtle, it's smaller. Therefore, our minimum standard, which Thomas mentioned, is a little bit more rigorous than in other regions. But it's been in use here for so long and on such a wide variety of sites that we have lots of great examples of the kinds of data collection parameters that really the minimum standard that needs to be used. And I know Kevin will probably chime in on this too. It's not hard to find this stuff in the literature. Also, the SHPO is now coming out with new guidelines that has this sort of information in it. Thomas mentioned that I think they'll be available in the summer. Is that right, Thomas? Sometime soon.
Hoping. Yeah.
Yeah, and these are just basically minimum standards. So, but it's really not that hard, I think, to meet the minimum. A lot of the instrumentation that's available to use, to buy or rent, is basically set up to do that already. So we're not using these instruments in unusual ways, and we're not. I don't think we're going to obscene levels to get really, really high density data. We're doing, enough to detect the archaeology that we know from experience is out there in Ohio to locate. If you take the same equipment to other places with other kinds of soils and geology, then you need to think about those methods, rethink that. Are those methods sufficient to find the archaeologies there? For instance, in Ohio, there are parts of Ohio that are quite sandy, like the entire Northwest. Just about all of it is pretty sandy. And I hate to say it, but sandy soil is very low contrast for magnetics. So if you're going to employ that there, you better make darn sure that you're really careful collecting and processing those data, and that you are looking, when you're doing your interpretation, you're looking for very subtle things. So knowing that ahead of time, helps direct you toward what you're going to look for. Say versus in the Scioto Valley, where the soil is quite magnetic, and like every darn rock shows up. So you have to come up with another way to sort through all the rocks you're going to detect, but it can be done.
Kevin, did you want to address anything there?
I do have thoughts about minimum standards for methods, and if you're looking at getting into this, there are some pretty basic resources that you can go into that talk about the principles that determine your sampling density and the types of measurements that you want to make. This is something we've been dealing with recently. Don't need to get into that, but there are authoritative guides out there that talk about the justification for the sampling densities that you see people like Jared using, and the folks in the UK and EU that are using this a lot more. I mean, there are justifications for that, but it basically comes down to sampling theory. If your sampling interval is bigger than the thing that you want to find, you're not going to find it, and so you can't do a reading every meter and expect to find features that are a meter across. You're going to have maybe one reading that might be out of the ordinary. You need to get that trend. You need to do the 10 centimeter or 12.5 centimeter sampling along transects in order to get that. And so, if you want a really quick guide to places to find stuff, do what I did. Download all of Jared's reports and look at his bibliography. That's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to say the guidelines. Jared's already provided us some of that, and we will have some of those standards, those minimum standards of collecting data. I thought the original question was how you're interpreting those anomalies into as cultural features, but there's lots of information that is out there on the standards for the survey. Then taking that data and then interpreting that and extrapolating into that, what are potential cultural features, that's something where I'm not sure if our guidelines are going to get into that much.
Well, so this is something I thought about a lot early on when I was presenting, results, and I realized that one needs to bring a consistent approach to interpreting the data, and one needs to show in the report how exactly you're doing that. So that's why I often seemingly belabor the point of, there are these kinds of anomalies out there in the world, and these are often what they look like in archaeology. So I'm going to apply this kind of anomaly typology to the data, and that's how I'm picking the things I think are archaeology. And I've always attempted to overpick things. So I'm being conservative in the sense that more than likely all the anomalies that I pick on the first round are not all archaeology. Some are going to be natural features, and that's why we employ coring to then evaluate these and to help rule out some of the things I overpicked, because sometimes that really awesome feature that looks awesome in excavation is really ephemeral geophysically. You may have detected it, but there are a billion other things that look just like it in the data. And this is going to become a much bigger problem when we're talking about surveying 100 acres versus surveying 1 acre. There will be way more things in a lot of cases. So we're going to have to get smarter about sampling because we can't possibly core 10,000 anomalies on a survey. And we're going to have to think about stratified sampling strategies. And so, identifying, hey, look, there's a cluster of anomalies. Chances are that might be part of some kind of archaeology site. So, if I go in there and I core some percentage of them and they're all positive, then chances are the rest of them are going to be positive in some way too. So I really don't need to do any more within that cluster, so those kinds of strategies, we'll have to get smart about thinking in that way too. And to be honest, we've been thinking this way for forever in doing. This is why we do shovel test intervals at 15-meter intervals, because we know that that's a sufficient data density in order to locate archaeological resources or sites of a particular size. And more often than not, those are the ones that we find to be significant after sufficient amounts of investigation. But there are all kinds of archaeology that we don't find with 15-meter shovel test intervals, for example, because, for instance, in areas that are unplowed or less plowed, in other words, they have really good site structure, there's lots of great artifact clusters that will occur in between a 15-meter shovel test interval. You may not even see those, and yet there's amazing site structure there. We've encountered this in a number of occasions, and actually geophysical survey helped because we can go through and survey the whole area. It's only like an acre or two or whatever with a magnetometer, and we can see where all those features are. And the features don't often correlate to the locations of the artifacts. That's because the site is really intact and there's good site structure.
So we only have about 5 minutes left, but I wanted to throw this question out here that someone put in the chat. So how does the cost of a phase one geophysical survey compare to traditional phase one that relies on pedestrian survey and or shovel testing, for example, with a 1 acre area, 20 acres or 100 acre?
Just think about that for a minute, and you can imagine that cost effectiveness goes up as you survey bigger areas with the magnetometer. So that's a really good thing to think about, and it's going to depend on what equipment you're using and how big of an area you're surveying, and that sort of thing. So also your objective,
economy and scale.
Yeah, there's economy and scale, but also your objectives. We're not always looking for pre-contact period Native American sites. Sometimes we're looking for historic period sites.
Right. Somebody asked a question about that in the chat too. So.
Yeah, and so in the guidelines, you'll see a case study or a scenario where, we're often faced with these old county atlases, and they show the locations of houses, and we all know that they're more or less in the right spots. But when you go out there on the ground and try to look for that could be 100 or 200 or 300 meters different, when you're standing there on the ground. So how do you find it? You could just shovel test that whole area, or you could use a geophysical survey technique that's really good at locating historic era middens. And you could even do that very low density, and you could find, the site more or less that way. So it'd be akin to doing shovel tests, only way, way faster. Assuming certain parameters, like that the midden is in the plow zone or near surface, that sort of stuff. So there are different ways to employ this stuff to be cost effective. And there will be settings where it just isn't cost effective.
And we also had a couple of people address, why not use, what about using LiDAR and drones at phase one to identify resources of interest or areas of interest?
I don't know how people do this stuff, in reality, but if you're not using Ohio's LiDAR data with every project, what's wrong with you? It's free. It's easy to download. It's very easy to image. You should be using that. And what I can tell you from a lot of weekends of poring over LiDAR data and aerial photos to look for earthworks, for example, is that most of the ones that show up in the LiDAR data are already known and documented, because you literally will trip over them, when you're walking around out there in the landscape. So it's the rare earthwork anyhow, and by earthwork I mean enclosure of some sort, that is undocumented and shows up in an obvious way in LiDAR data. But that's not to say there aren't unknown ones in LiDAR data. There are.
And historical features that might show up, non-earthwork things.
Yeah, sure. Yep. LiDAR data, I mean, it's just a topographic map. So we all look at topographic maps to think about the archaeological landscape. It used to be 7.5 minute quads was our data source. Well, now we have this 1.5 to 2 meter resolution LiDAR that covers the entire state. It ain't great, but it's a heck of a lot higher resolution than a 7.5 minute topo quad. So there are lots of archaeological resources that can be found that way.
So I just want to end the conversation with one other question that was posed that someone gets asked by her organization. Says, if we do a geophysical survey, do we still have to do another kind of survey to determine if there's a site there? In other words, what they want to know is, if you do geophysical, can you clear an area? Because in their minds, I'm not being more efficient if I end up having to survey by more traditional methods to properly investigate an area anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't want to do an entire phase 2 project on a phase 1. So that is going to be probably, and Thomas can talk about this because I know this is what he's thinking about. That's going to be one of the challenges with employing this at the phase 1 level. But maybe there are other means that are quick to help evaluate areas. And maybe this is some of what Kevin was talking about. Geochemical testing, if it's fast, or a different kind of technique, or examining a whole series of aerial photographs or LiDAR data or all that. So, yeah.
All right, so I see Eric's back on, so we better get moving along. I just want to thank you 3 guys for agreeing to participate in the conversation, which I think we'll continue to have in some form or another as we go along. So thanks a lot.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for organizing, Al. Thanks for the great questions, everybody.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, I think this was a very productive panel discussion. It looks like there's appetite for more, so maybe we'll consider, further discussions over the summer and, see what the fall looks like as well. Sounds like a good opportunity if someone wants to do a pilot study on some new phase 1 geophysics implementation. Maybe they should apply for an SM Price grant. I don't know. Throw that out there. But anyway, moving along here. Our next presenter is Jared Burks, so you get to hear more of him about geophysics and earthworks. His presentation is titled, "There's More Than One Way to Make a Great Circle, Magnetic Survey Results from the Deer Creek Circle and the Birch Site." Did I say that right? Birch?
Yeah, pretty much. Birch.
Okay. So without further ado, Jared Burks, take it away.
All right, let's see if I can share my screen.
And actually, sorry, I do have one thing to mention that I forgot to mention earlier, and this just is more for Kevin's reference and everyone else who's a co-host. You'll see that you're all listed as recording right now. That's just because Kevin is recording. You're not actually recording. It's just listed as recording because you are a co-host. So please do not hit pause or stop on the button on your screen. I accidentally did that because I thought I was recording independently. So there's going to be like 2 seconds on Kevin's recording that it is paused. He won't have. So just thought I'd let all the co-presenters know, do not hit pause or stop on the recording. You're not actually recording. It's just Kevin. So thought I'd get that out of the way. Without further ado, Jared Burks on Earthworks.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. And so hopefully you are now seeing what I'm seeing. Does that look right?
Yes. Yes, I can see it.
All right, there we go. And okay. So as you know, I have earthwork fever, and I have inflicted that upon Al and several other people. And often during the winters, we find several earthwork sites to go out and survey, usually with magnetometer, and see what we can find. This is all funded on our own dime, and we do it kind of under the umbrella of the Heartland Earthworks Conservancy. But we're using instruments that I borrow from work. Thankfully, they allow me to do that. And so this winter, we focused on, actually, we surveyed quite a number of sites, but the two I want to talk to you about are Deer Creek Circle and the Birch site. So I think, as you know, Ohio has an abundance of circular earthwork sites. This is just one, the Junction Group, last fall. And circles come in lots of different sizes and arrangements, from relatively small enclosures with ditches and embankments to these kind of weird composite earthwork complexes that have lots of other kinds of things in addition to circles at them. They are located, within massive earthwork complexes like Hopewell Mound Group, and have been known for many years. And there are an awful lot of unknown ones out there. And it seems like a lot of the new things that are being found in aerial photographs, in particular by David Lamp, are circular enclosures. So maybe you can spot that circle there, right in the middle. Pretty good sized thing, 300 feet across, previously unknown. Dave spotted it just by scanning aerial photographs. This is Google Earth image, by the way, people. Anybody could have found this. So as of 1914, we were aware of nearly 600 enclosure sites in Ohio, and these come from Mills Atlas, obviously. And there's a class of earthwork in there, large circular enclosures, something you might want to call a great circle, that there are fewer of. And if you look closely on that map there, you'll see black stars. Those are the big earthwork complexes like Hopeton and Frankfurt and Newark and Marietta and so on. And three of these, just three, have standalone great circles. And by great circles, and in particular, I'm talking about the greatest circles, in other words, the really big ones, something on the order of 850 feet in diameter or bigger. They're often in that 1,000-foot diameter range. There are only three previously known standalone great circles of that scale. One of them is at the Newark Earthworks. And you may not think of this as a standalone enclosure, but the Great Circle, and I suspect that someday somebody will figure out that the Great Circle was probably there early on and might even predate a lot of the rest of the Newark Earthworks. But you'll notice that it's not connected directly to other earthwork components, say like this other Great Circle over here, the Observatory Circle, which is clearly an integral part of the Octagon Observatory Circle complex. So we're talking about standalone things. So there's the Great Circle. To give you a sense of scale, if that doesn't, there's me standing in the ditch at the Great Circle at Newark. If you've not been to the Newark Earthworks, even if you don't care that much about earthworks, you really need to go look at this place. There's a reason that they're attempting to put this on the World Heritage List. This is a phenomenally large enclosure, standalone enclosure, that's one of the best intact in, well, anywhere. Let's just say that. In the known universe. Worth a look. On that previous thing, I meant to point out that a lot of these great circles and other enclosures for that matter have something often right in the middle of them. In this case, Eagle Mound at the Great Circle. So this is a mound that has multiple lobes, and it covers the footprint of a wooden building. Okay, so we're going to talk about two different kinds of great circles with the rest of my time here. And we're going to start with the Deer Creek Circle, which is located in the Scioto River Valley, home of an obscene number of earthworks. And I kind of clipped off the Scioto River there at Deer Creek. And then after we get done with Deer Creek, we'll move over to the Birch site, which is in Indiana. But technically it's an Ohio earthwork because the Whitewater River flows into the Great Miami River in Ohio. So we'll just kind of lump it in. But you'll notice that there are a heck of a lot of similarities with between earthworks all across the middle Ohio Valley. So that silly little boundary there between Indiana and Ohio doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of earthworks, except it's a lot farther to drive to Indiana. So the Deer Creek Circle. This is a view from about, I don't know how many feet, 300 to 400 feet up from a drone of kind of that landscape, big agricultural landscape. So ideal area for large scale geophysical surveys. That's about where the earthwork is, to give you a sense of scale. It is massive. This is we think, a ditch and embankment enclosure. It was previously undocumented. We'll get to that in a minute. And it's probably about 1,800 years old. And that's just sort of my catch-all age for earthworks that we don't know the age of, because that's about kind of right at the middle of sort of the range of building big earthworks in Ohio, although a lot of them came just after this. So for scale, there's the Archeo van down there, that little white blob, and me and probably Al standing somewhere down there next to the van. So I need to give some thanks before I move on to talk about this project. I couldn't have gotten out there with the help of Sean Skinner. Getting access to survey earthwork sites on private property can be very challenging. And this one was found 2 or 3 years ago now. And it took that long to negotiate access. So we only got around to doing the survey late last year. So Sean helped us meet Teresa, who is the sister of Karen, who owns the property. And Teresa was instrumental in helping us negotiate access to do the survey. A lot of folks aren't so keen on knowing that they own an earthwork. They're very protective of their property for obvious reasons. And they're very worried that finding something like this on their property is going to cause them to change, the way that the property is used, or heaven forbid, somebody's going to take the property from them now that we know that there's an earthwork there. So these are all real issues we have to grapple with when trying to negotiate access. And then finally, David Orr, a local farmer and archaeology enthusiast, did some mowing for us out there before we did the survey. So there are other people that need to be mentioned that are critical to this, that we wouldn't have been out there without their help. And in particular, David Lamp is one of them. Dave found this circle. And all of these other little yellow stars out here are mostly thanks to Dave poring over aerial photographs in his free time. He's covered lots of southern Ohio and has found dozens of new undocumented, I guess they would be old, undocumented earthwork sites that we just didn't know about until he spotted them in aerial photos. And this is where the Deer Creek Circle is located. So it's not a surprise that in areas where there are high concentrations of already known earthworks, like counties, let's say, Ross County, Pickaway County, Franklin County, Licking County, if you pour over old aerial photographs, you are bound to find more sites that we didn't know about. That just makes sense in terms of sampling. So look at this map in other areas where there are lots of earthwork sites down in the southwest corner, all throughout sort of south central Ohio, especially in this direction, maybe not so much in the hills toward the Hocking River, but that's where we're going to find lots of undocumented earthworks. Here is Ross County, land of the earthwork, and there are an awful lot of them there, something like 37, I think. And there are probably more that we don't know about. And Deer Creek is up there at the top in the Deer Creek Valley. And if you're familiar with the area, this is where Route 104 is on the west side of the Saddle River. There was another earthwork not too far away, just a few miles, that was also spotted on an aerial photograph, Google Earth by Harry Campbell. We went out and did a mag survey a few years back, and voila, new circular earthwork. So this is what Dave saw and sent me an image of a couple of years back. That sort of circular smudge in the 1960 or so aerial photograph. It's massive, but it's sort of unmistakably circular. You'll notice that there are lots of other things out here in the landscape that are big and sort of darker in color. And you think, wow, those could be earthworks too. And they do make it harder to identify these earthworks, but this is basically geometrically perfect circle. that doesn't normally happen in nature. So this piqued Dave's attention. And then I made this little animation to just sort of show several different area photographs through time. And so this is one of the other kind of criteria that you know you've got an earthwork when it appears in lots of different aerial photographs. So watch that again. And it's there in the 50s, it's there in the 60s, it's there in the 70s. And then it starts to get harder to see it, but it even shows up in some of the more recent, at least bits of it do, more recent aerial photos if you look hard enough. So what it doesn't show up in is LiDAR data. So somebody asked us about using LiDAR to find earthwork sites. So that's where the earthwork should be. And there's the landscape there, and you really can't see it. There might be little bits of it there, but it's super subtle, and there are lots of definitely more distinctive topographic features out there than that real faint indication of an earthwork, which you really can't see anyhow. So this is why, you know, LiDAR is one tool, but it is definitely not the only tool for finding these very large earthworks. There's a closer up view of basically nothing. When the LiDAR data were collected, there was a stand of pine trees here. That's why it looks sort of weird there. It's really hard for the LiDAR data to penetrate dense stands of pine trees. So you get this very low resolution data there. Those have since been removed, and that's now an open field, which was lucky for us. So just to give you a sense of geology, this is a glacial outwash terrace. It's high up above the nearby stream, Deer Creek. So this area is no longer flooded anymore, although it can get pretty wet back here at the edge of this terrace. The soil is loamy, so that's nice, good for magnetics, but it is a little bit more sandy than I anticipated. So when I discovered that on the first day, I knew that maybe the earthwork would be somewhat subtle in the data. So the soils are formed into outwash sand and gravel. Good to know. Could be magnetically subtle, at least for Ohio. We use this machine to do the survey, and you'll notice that it's big and that I have to push it in this case. So this was all done with push cart. Has 5 magnetometer probes on it. You'll see the spacing there is it's 50 centimeters. These tubes are spaced at 25 centimeters. So we used a 50 centimeter probe spacing, and we collected 10 readings per meter along those lines, 50 centimeter space lines. And this is what made that all possible. This is part of an RTK GNSS system, so a GPS system that has a base station somewhere nearby in this case, that sends correction signals. So every single magnetic data point is accurate to within 1 to 2 centimeters of that base station location. The base station location may be way off if we took bad readings when setting it up, but every reading taken with the magnetometer will all be off the same amount, if that makes sense to you. But usually the base station, when we collect, when we set up our own base station coordinates, they're within 30 centimeters or so of the real spot, as close as we can get. Okay, at the Deer Creek Circle, this was the only crew shot I had taken from the drone. Al wasn't there that day, Harry came out with me. But here is our day 1 result. Woohoo! It definitely is an earthwork. It's kind of subtle, but I think you can probably pick out the earthwork there. Following that same diameter, the same position as what Dave identified in the aerial photograph. Maybe you can also see some interesting stuff there outside the earthwork. If you've listened to talks before on geophysical surveys on earthwork sites, one of the things that we're discovering as we survey more and more of these is that there often are things of interest just outside the enclosures and not too far away, but far enough that, you know, if you weren't using a big multi-probe system, you might not survey that far away because that's a lot of ground right there, 50 meters, 30, 50 meters away. So obviously on day 2, I wanted to see if this line of anomalies was going to keep going, and I had visions of it encircling the whole thing. But that wasn't to be. It did keep going, but it stopped eventually. So there those things are, but there's an awful big cluster of them right there. On day 3, we extended the survey over to the road, and you can begin to see there used to be an old wire fence line along the road enclosing the fields. That fence is now gone, but remains of it are still there underground, so that's what that is. You can see lots of these really big, weird things in the data. These are lightning strikes. And you can see a few large, strong anomalies. Don't know what those are, but they're out there. They're probably some kind of depression filled with topsoil. And then in the end, that's what we ended up with after 5 days of survey. So we're doing this on the weekend, 1 day at a time, often a Sunday, sometimes a Saturday. So this was 5 trips. We covered about 51 acres. You know, we're not getting up obscenely early to go do this, and it's an hour drive. So we managed to get the entire enclosure. One of the issues with doing geophysical surveys is data processing. And there are lots of options one can pick from when processing data. And ultimately, what you're trying to do when processing data is remove as many data defects that you caused as possible, and then remove things that obscure the archaeology. So in our case, it's often trying to minimize plow marks because they can be distinctive. And so I'm just flashing 2 different versions of the map here with 2 types of filtering. And what's important to notice, and we're going to zoom in on this area here, is that, so there's the earthwork right there. And watch it as it changes. So between the 2 types, and some of the data processing can filter out the earthwork, which is not such a good thing. So I often do both and present both. But what we found here is, I think, the remains of a ditch and an embankment enclosure. And it's very faint, but I think that's the ditch. Often the ditches are the most distinctive component of Ohio earthworks or Middle Ohio Valley earthworks because they're filled with topsoil, and that stuff's more magnetic, so it stands out nicely. And then I think, though I'm not certain, the embankment is located to the inside of the ditch. Now you might be saying, that's kind of unusual. We don't see that very often. Most of Ohio earthworks have ditches on the inside of the embankment, including Great Circles. For instance, the Newark Great Circle is that way. But not so far away in the same county is the Shriver Circle, another Great Circle, standalone. And it had a ditch on the outside and an embankment on the inside of the enclosure. So there's precedent for this. I wish the Deer Creek Circle was this easy to see, but it's not. Another interesting thing about the Shriver Circle is it has an awful lot of gateways for an earthwork site, a circular earthwork site. You can see that we've detected those 2 there in the magnetic data. Another one there that doesn't seem to show up in the Squire and Davis map, and makes me wonder if there perhaps isn't yet another one here that would be right about in this location where we couldn't survey, making 4 sets of paired gateways. That would be interesting. Shriver, just like the Great Circle in Newark, has a mound or had a mound in the middle of it. We detected that mound in the magnetic data, and we'll zoom in on that. Of course, there's a nice pipe going through it. That's sort of Murphy's Law of finding cool stuff in magnetic data. But maybe you've noticed some weird arcing things there in the magnetic data that don't look like pipes. And that is directly beneath a small topographic feature there that's the mound located in the middle of the enclosure. This area has subsequently been surveyed again by the German team with Brett Ruby, and they found more evidence to show that, yeah, this is something very interesting in the middle of this earthwork site. So at Deer Creek Circle, I had my eyes attuned to look for multiple gateways and something in the middle. And the gateways are kind of a hard sell. That one on the left there, upper left, I think is probably a gateway. It sort of looks like one. The other 2, though, are more questionable. It's hard to say. Plowing has really damaged this site. So it's hard to see the gateways, unfortunately. Right in the middle, though, we'll zoom in on that. And one thing you'll notice is this very lovely lightning strike to the left. But the geometric middle of this circle is somewhere right in here. And maybe you're already picking up on that very subtle circular feature that is right in the middle of the Shriver Circle. You know, throw this thing on the ground anywhere in Ohio, and it might be very hard to know that this is archaeology because it's quite subtle. But I keyed in right away on this thing because it's an arcing feature, looks like it's part of a perfect circle. It goes in a different direction than the plowing. And it is different than the kind of the geology that we've detected in the magnetic data too. So it's something. And the fact that it's right in the middle of an enormous circular earthwork suggests that it's something related to that earthwork. So these pit features back here, let's just zoom in on them really quick. You can see there's a nice line of them.
What?
They're somewhat evenly spaced. And initially I thought, was this a historic era thing? Because we've never seen this sort of thing at a Ohio earthwork site. But, you know, it's not in a perfect line. They're not perfectly spaced. You know, there's some variability. Some of them seem to be missing. So that's pretty consistent with feature distributions that we see, you know, from 1800 years ago. Also, this cluster here is very unusual. It looks like that it's multiple very large pit features all very close together. These things are 1.5 to 4 meters in diameter, so they're massive. And they range from 10 to 35 nanotesla in their magnetic strength. And often things that are as strong as 35 nanotesla have burning in them. So these may all be burn features, especially the ones that have this sort of white halo around them. Now, Brett Ruby is probably scratching his head and say, hey, I remember when you thought that something like that was a burned house at Hopewell Mountain Group, and it turned out to be a borrow pit for sand. Yeah, these could also be little borrow pits for something like sand. It is a sandy site. So we just don't know what these are yet. But they're definitely out there, and my guess is they're related to the earthwork. And then finally, the last sort of thing we found in the very last bit of data we collected was a teeny little cluster of anomalies here outside the enclosure on a bit of a topographic bump. And there it is there. The reason that caught my eye is it's sort of circular, and it's not unlike small circular clusters of anomalies and features that have been found at other earthwork sites during large-scale surveys. For example, at SIPE earthworks. So this one isn't quite as good as these ones at SIPE, but it's certainly in the neighborhood for what it might be. So this may be a post-circle or structure with some internal pit features or burned areas. The kinds of things that we might expect, you know, outside a massive bit of monumental architecture. Could there be more if we keep going? Sure. I kind of had to stop because I had to go survey the Birch site. So what we plan to do out there next is survey more as time allows. And we'll probably do this with a towed magnetometer array so we can cover ground faster. So speaking of Birch, let's head over there. It is in eastern Indiana, as we mentioned, on the Whitewater River. This is what it looks like. It is a big, for the most part, big open farm fields, so ideal for magnetic survey. It was first mapped in the late 1800s by J.C. McPherson. There's this map there. And he only documented at that time 2 enclosures, which he thought were sort of circular. And this is where they are today on the landscape. So this is how that map fits kind of on the landscape. So we can still see those have topographic elements to them. This is where we typically like to start when looking at these old earthwork sites, aerial photographs, and as many as we can look at. And this one in particular is quite juicy, full of all kinds of enclosures. There are the 2 that McPherson documented. And there are lots and lots more you might see in there. And you could probably spot perhaps even more than I've pointed out here. This map was the basis for one of the more recent sort of interpretations of what the site consists of. So this site has been excavated and studied a bit starting in the 1960s by Jay Heilman, who worked inside the Big Circle did some excavations in here. And then Ball State has done some work out there testing some of these smaller anomalies and doing some excavations up here. This was all in the 60s and 70s and maybe even early 80s. Fast forward to just, I want to say a few years ago, although this photograph is now nearly 10 years old. And Jamie Davis was interested in earthworks, of course. And he found this aerial photograph. I think it might have been the base map that Esri was using for ArcMap. And it's pretty easy to spot some really clear aerial indications of earthworks here. So that got us to wondering, maybe we don't know all what's out there. And so Jamie spent some time interpreting aerial photographs and came up with this map. And immediately I'm thinking, wow, that looks like a big circle right there of enclosures. And you really don't know that that's a possibility until you get, enough of them in place to see that pattern. So one wonders, are there any here or are there any here? And we were able to test that with Kevin Nolan's help in getting us access. This farm was up for sale a few years ago. We got permission before it was sold to go out there and have a look. It happened to be a bean field at the time, and beans were short enough that we were able to collect some mag data in there, just a few hours worth. And sure enough, detected little enclosures that looked very similar to what were being observed in the aerial photographs. And they kind of confirmed that this has just got to be, a full circle of enclosures. And there's probably one right in there too. And we tried to collect magnetic data in there, but too much iron stuff in there. We couldn't see past that to see earthwork ditches. So this all was published in the OAC volume, Encountering Hopewell, the first volume. Jamie and I did a little chapter in there, and the interpretation map is sort of buried amongst other interpretation maps in one of our figures, but there it is, what we knew as of the Encountering Hopewell volume about birch. Big circle. Actually, that number I think is wrong. We'll see the real number later. It's more like 800. What was it? 885, I think, feet. As I thought about places to go survey, this place obviously was high on my list, but getting access was pretty challenging. So in kind of wetting the whistle, so to speak, of my earthwork fever, I put one of these little animations together of aerial photos from birch, and then reinterpreted them to see if I couldn't pull out any more enclosures. And eventually it's going to get to this interpretation map. And actually was able to see another couple in there that we weren't able to spot before. There are always new aerial photographs being taken or being made available of these places. So it's worth checking, to see if there are new aerials. And that's what we came up with. Couldn't really see gateways on a lot of these, except these ones here that Jamie had spotted. But definitely a full circle of enclosures. So there's Jamie's interpretation versus my newer one. So very similar, except for the addition of these guys in here. So we finally got permission to get out there this year, or late last year. It took 10 trips to cover the entire site, and we did it between October 25th and March 15th. So we just finished up earlier this year. Important to note, each trip involved 4 hours of driving to get there. So we did this one day a weekend. We didn't leave particularly early, but we did get back usually around 7 o'clock at night. It was me plus Al and Harry again in the field. And we have to give thanks to John Flood, and oddly enough, Sean Coughlin, if you're out there in the world watching this, it was something you had posted on Facebook that sort of got this ball rolling and connected me with John, an archaeologist in Indiana, primarily, who then connected me with Jamie Wessler, a local guy who's incredibly enthusiastic about this site and actually worked with Jay Heilman on the excavation when Jamie was a kid, like 12 years old, 10 or 12 years old. He arranged for us to get access to all the properties. So one of the landowners let us park the Archeo van in his area, and the goal was to survey the whole place, which was big. So we started with the high probability area, across the middle, and there was day one. And in comparing day one to our aerial photograph interpretations, we can see they look very similar, except now in the magnetic data, we've detected all the gateways. And one of our possible little squircle things here has become a circle, actually, in the magnetic data. Let's see. Another thing that day one confirmed is that it's looking like most of the gateways are pointing toward the interior. But some of the enclosures have gateways that point in lots of other interesting directions. So they're not all focused on this main circular arrangement. Let's see, and we found a new one. That one right there that's being pointed to was not found in the aerial photographs. I see Eric is coming on visually, so he's probably about to tell me your time is up. So let me just fast forward here to the end, because you need to see the full Monty here. Well, maybe not the full Monty, but all of the magnetic data. So we definitely confirmed this is a large circular arrangement of small enclosures. It is about 885 feet in diameter. Most of the enclosures have gateways that point toward the middle. Alas, there isn't some really cool thing right in the middle. These other ones that have gateways that are hard to see or you can't see them, most likely have gateways that point that way too. But interestingly enough, two of the enclosures have gateways that point in some other direction, and they are directly across from each other in that circular arrangement. I don't know what that means, but it's got to mean something. We've got an array of circles and these super ellipses, as Tim Eberhardt calls them, or squares with rounded corners or whatever. And finally, what I wanted to end with was, it's not just a big circle that these things make. The circle has a very intriguing gap in it that seems to line up with these linear arrangements of enclosures here. And I'm hoping that shape there that I've badly drawn on top of the magnetic data provokes some memories from slides earlier in this presentation. For example, this one, that shape is quite common at the Newark Earthworks. Where did I go? There they are. So that was my last slide there. I don't know that if this site is related to the Newark Earthworks, but isn't that interesting? So lots and lots more work to be done in figuring out what the heck the Birch site means, but this is why we need to do lots of magnetic survey, in particular, probably other kinds of geophysics at these earthwork sites, because there's a heck of a lot more out there in need of study. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Jared. And for everyone's reference, we're not having questions right now. We'll probably leave the Zoom meeting up for the virtual posters and also for questions that anyone might have for our presenters from the morning or our panelists. So if you've got questions, you can always send them in the chat, and then Jared could answer them in the chat, or any of the other presenters. Or you could have a conversation with them. We can do breakout sessions during lunch, but I thought I'd mention that as well. Thank you again to Jared for that presentation. And now we are going to switch over to Elizabeth Hogue, who is presenting an update on the Shaker Dig program, Shaker Heights, Ohio. So if you do you need any technical assistance, IT assistance?
No, I think I have it, right? You're all
Yes,
seeing
I can see it, and we are good to go.
Great. I'm actually going to toggle back before to different things. I think we've got this technology sorted out. But anyway, wow, Jared, that was so cool. It's always you're a hard act to follow, talking about something completely different and not mounds. But an update to the Shaker archaeology that I've been doing up here in Northeast Ohio, giving an update about how we were able to survive a pandemic and keep a program alive when things looked like that maybe they weren't going to be the case. So my name is Elizabeth Hogue. Y'all can call me Beth. My pronouns are she, her, and I teach at the Cleveland Institute of Art, which is an unlikely place to find an archaeologist, but that's a story for another day. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, and I will, gosh, I can't believe it was only 2 years ago. It feels like forever ago when we had the OAC session talking about public archaeology and fieldwork opportunities, where I got to talk briefly about what we're doing up here in Shaker Heights. And for those of you that either weren't there or forgot about it, which is fine, I'll give a brief introduction about what we're doing to put this in context. So I'm sure many of you know public archaeology is a growing field within the broader work of archaeology, seeking to involve community members and stakeholders and give them a voice in their projects, allowing them to see the archaeological process and understand its implications for the narratives in their own communities. Many archaeologists argue, and I am one of them, that it's part of actually our ethical duty as archaeologists to create methodologies that allow for public collaboration wherever possible. Advocates of this approach, like me, want to engage with the public, but also evaluate the effectiveness of the way that we interact with the public and constantly look for ways to make archaeology more accessible, visible, and relevant to the general public. In striving to do so as public archaeologists, this practice will allow community members to help set the agenda, and not just community members, but also stakeholders to help set the agenda, and when possible, help facilitate how a community uses its past and its present, right? And that's been our driving goal for this project that I'm pleased to say we're entering into our 7th year doing here in Shaker Heights. In a recent comprehensive publication that I highly recommend, and I think is actually available for free download, Key Concepts in Public Archaeology by Gabriel Moshenko argues that the field of public archaeology is by its nature a hybrid discipline. There are multiple stakeholders and a variety of goals and methods of engagement with the public. We here in Shaker Heights do what Moshenko kind of categorizes archaeologists working with the public, community archaeology and heritage projects run by museums, university, or commercial units. And we also do a little bit of educational archaeology, that formal and informal learning about archaeology in the past in schools, museums, online, and kind of out there in the real world. When community members are engaged in research of the past, either through archival or documents or archaeology work, they increase their knowledge and understanding of their community's history, and they can see the importance of that history, right? So just to give us a background here, I'm up here in Cuyahoga County in the city of Shaker Heights. There's a map of the kind of modern look. I know some of you have been up in here, some of you are from Northeast Ohio, so maybe you can picture what this community looks like today in your minds. The city of Shaker Heights has a really complicated and multifaceted history, right? Kind of 2 major stories that we tell up here. And some of those stories are better known than others. From 1882 to 1889, this whole region was home to the North Union sect of the Shaker religious community. At its maximum, in about 1850, there were about 300 members that lived here in this area. And you can see I've highlighted the North family, the Center family, and the East family, the kind of how they broke down their community there within the Shaker Heights. By the 1860s, social trends in the US were starting to change. We were becoming increasingly more materialistic society, and that was not part of the tenets of the central core of the Shakers. With religious revivals like the Shakers were on the wane, and communal societies were losing their appeal. Converts became fewer, and Shakerism began to decline, not just here in Shaker Heights, but across the country. The Shaker community here disbanded in 1889 when the last of the Shakers left to continue their faith with other Shaker communities, some in Kentucky and other places that were still going on in through the early part of the 20th century. So these are just 2 of the images of some of the Shaker buildings that are no longer standing. These pictures were taken around the 19-teens, right before the second part of the Shaker story comes, and that comes from the Van Swearingen brothers. After the Shakers left, Otis and Mantis Van Swearingen bought up all this property to create a community. They envisioned a garden suburb located, an elite garden suburb located up on this escarpment 500 feet above the industrial city of Cleveland. They began their development here in 1905. In 1912, it was formally recognized as Shaker Village and officially incorporated as Shaker Heights City in 1931. When most of the construction of the homes took place at that time. So what's really interesting here, and I want to give a shout out to the Shaker Historical Society Museum who helps us with this work. Their museum is actually located in one of these beautiful homes. It was built in 1910 and converted into the museum and the kind of Shaker Heights Society, Shaker Heights Historical Society in the 1960s. What that means though is that finding historic or prehistoric sites here in Shaker Heights is really hard because almost all of this area has been built over the last 100 years, right? Even these 3 areas that I've circled here, again, there are no buildings left, so we can't go find remains. It's really hard. They've all been built over by subsequent housing. Doesn't mean there aren't sites there, though, and there's not opportunity to do public archaeology and historic archaeology here in Shaker Heights. So from its inception, my idea has always been to create a project that invite young people to engage in the process of archaeology. I work with kids sometimes as young as 5 or 6. It can be challenging, things like attention span, enthusiasm, endurance, just generally not wanting to be outside and doing what we're doing, because it is a little bit tedious sometimes. But we find that young people are actually really excited and enthusiastic about this, especially when it's structured in the right way. So way back when, in the beginning of spring of 2015, Dr. Ware Petznick, who was the then director of the Shaker Historical Society, and I began to plot and scheme and to design an educational archaeological project that she ultimately dubbed the Shaker Dig, and that name has stuck, to focus on local historical archaeology in our community, which could be used not just to conduct archaeological research in the area, which was something that was important, but also to create an engaged community experience. So we partner with local elementary school teacher and amateur archaeology, Rosemary Nemeth, who I don't think was able to come watch today, but a shout out to her nonetheless, because she had connections with local elementary schools, summer youth programs, and colleges. And together we created this program where teachers could work along with us to receive continuing education credits, and school-age children could have an opportunity to get their hands dirty, and everybody could experience a real archaeological site in their own community. The first site that we found actually was a result of me walking my dog. I know I've shown this picture before, and I have to say, rest in peace to my old lady dog, Karma, who we had to say goodbye to this past winter, but we still credit her with helping me discover the first place that we worked at as part of this project. We call this the Neal Farmstead. I came across the site while I was walking my dog, and I found some artifacts poking up out of the tree roots there, and I instantly knew that they were not modern road debris. So in the summer of 2015, we worked with the Shaker Historical Society in the city of Shaker Heights to put together a program. We worked for a week with high school teachers, 2 high school teachers receiving continuing education credit, 5 children, including a couple of mine, and some adult volunteers who came out. Over the course of that week, we found 150 artifacts and may have found the stone foundation or chimney fall from the building that I'll show you in a moment, right? So we're talking about this area here. This is the 1858 map that shows location of a structure here. And if you're from Shaker Heights, this is Lee Road right here. And this is South Woodland Road right here. And this is one of the tributaries to the Dome Brook. It shows up again in this 1874 Titus map. But by the time we get to Shaker Heights in the 19-teens, it is no longer there. It's gone, right? And you can see that there's development. These roads have been put in all over the place here. Oops. These are some of the artifacts that we found. Some of them are a little bit newer, but some, like this piece of blue willow, and some of these nails were actually older. And possibly some of maybe a foundation or a chimney fall from the structure that we think we located. Unfortunately, we're never able to go back and continue that work because there was some work being done on the bridge and the aqueduct and the duct work underneath the Dome Brook there. And I think this site has been obliterated since. So well, that's a story for another day. But at any rate, what we were able to do with archival research through the Historical Museum with Dr. Petznick was reveal some clues about who these people were and who these individuals were that built this house. So we placed this in this larger context. She found through probate and genealogical records that this farmstead belonged along the Dome Brook had belonged to a man named John Neal Sr., an immigrant from the Isle of Man, was born there in 1872, and he and his wife Maria settled in this area in Shaker Heights in 1830. They, along with a larger Monks community, a number of settlers had come from the Isle of Man there and settled in this area. When he died, his son, John Neal Jr., took over his home and remained there until his death in 1880. John Neal Jr. was so integral to the nearby Shaker community that he was referred to as Shaker John, even though he himself was not a Shaker. Following John Jr.'s death, the house was apparently occupied by his son for a few years, and then sometime by the turn of the 20th century, the house was abandoned, had been taken down, and we see the green space in Shaker Heights now. John Neal's gravestone is located right here in Shaker Heights. Also, it's not in really great shape, but we're working to try to be able to do some restoration work in the cemetery here at some point in the future. So that was our first site that we worked at. The second one that we came to after we were no longer able to return to the Neal site is a site we dubbed the Shaker Lee site that exists on city property. This is also a little bit closer to the Shaker Historical Society Museum and Building, which meant access to bathrooms, which is always nice, right? When you're working on a program, especially with children, they always need to use the bathroom. We could walk there and go there if it rained or if it was really hot, or have the ability to move back and forth. We started here not sure what we might find. This place is located on the periphery of the Shaker Center family grouping, right? So this is the Center family homes. Where we were working at was just south of this area. We do know, and by here in the 19 teens, we see there's a structure there. This was the Shaker Village's first village hall and fire department from 1910 to 1930, and then it was torn down. So we weren't quite sure what we might find there, but it seemed like a good place to look. And it was, again, one of those open pieces of property. They're so hard to come by in Shaker Heights. It hasn't been built on. It was also where we worked was far away from the streets, so we weren't kind of engaged with street noise and street debris. And it was also nice and shady, which is always a plus with the kids. Over the course of 3 years here, we excavated several units with the young people and the volunteers that came to work with us, and we found hundreds of artifacts. Here we see an image of them working. Again, it was shady. You'll see this line of stones here. There was a greenhouse here that was built by the people who owned the property next door, and they used it as a greenhouse in the 1940s and 50s, I think. And we found artifacts pertaining to that. Also a lot of brick, glass, some ceramic pieces, some pieces of terracotta, things like flower pots and little marker. Actually, this is a really neat one, a marker from a brand of roses that were developed, a hybrid brand of roses called the Wyandotte, that were grown up in Menor, Ohio in the 1940s. And we found ties of those being grown in this greenhouse. Found some pretty little ceramic pieces that were really intriguing because they are either late 19th or early 20th century, and depending on their exact time, they're either late Shaker or early Shaker Heights, which has interesting interpretation implications either way. The Shakers were known for their adherence to the plain and simple life way, and to find a piece of beautifully decorated ceramics might suggest that perhaps sometimes they had to stray away from that dictate because these were the kinds of things that were available to them to purchase out here in the Western Reserve. Found some glass pieces, including this beautiful little piece of Pall Mall style machine etched glassware, some cranberry and amber glass and blue glass, and here's like a mason jar screw top. A lot of metal, including nails, some of which were square nails. So again, that kind of late 19th century, turn of the century, a belt buckle, a few other more modern pieces of metal. We're still working there. Analysis has been ongoing. It's been a lot of fun. And I think to date, we've served probably 30 or 40 children in total through the process of this program. We even did some lab work in the museum to wash our artifacts and show these children exactly how we put this all together, how we interpret the remains. Right, and so these archaeological excavations over the last couple of years have given us a really substantial amount of data about the history of this community, and it also served as a conduit for public engagement and participation. One of the core tenets of our project has always been to make sure that community members, especially young people, have this opportunity to participate in and contribute to the project. So these kids they dig with us, they wash artifacts, they help us understand them, we walk through all this process with them so they have a greater understanding of the historical process and what archaeology is here in Shaker Heights. So we wrapped this up. Our last field season was in 2019, and perhaps you can see where we're going with this, right? As we wrapped up this season, our 5th year, we were confident looking forward to what was coming next, thinking that, we just wrapped up 5 years and we could move on and begin to think about the next 5 years. But then of course that brings us to 2020, right? Would there even be a Shaker Dig 6? Will we be able to continue this project? And we faced a number of challenges this past year, besides the obvious, right? Our longtime historical museum director, Dr. Ware Petznick, stepped down in the fall of 2019 to pursue some other opportunities, and it took a little while to find a new director. Our new director, Brianna Trelevin, I'm not sure if she's watching out there, but I give her a big shout out for helping us out here. And educational director, Allison Henline, were hired in early 2020 and had just come on to their jobs when the pandemic hit and things closed down, right? Then COVID happened, the museum closed, and everything really looked doubtful. We wouldn't be able to have a camp. We wouldn't be able to continue to build on this momentum. And then I had an idea, right? What if we did a virtual yet still live hands-on camp that would give us an opportunity to engage with the public, to keep to gain in our continuity, and to maybe even usher in a new way of thinking about how we can engage with the public, right? And that brings us to this hands-on camp that we reimagined, we're actually successfully able to implement in the summer of 2020. We did a week-long camp, actually it was a 4-day-long camp. We met Monday through Wednesday with kids on Zoom because Rosemary Nemeth, my awesome teacher colleague, is really well-versed in this, having been online with her 4th grade elementary school kids for the better part of the spring semester at that point. And we talked about archaeology. We talked about what archaeology is, what we do, how we understand this. Rosemary created a Google Classroom that she put all these links and information that kids can engage with, activities, videos to watch, all kinds of things like that. And then after our brief Zoom meeting in the morning, we sent kids to do activities. We gave them a package of resources and kind of hands-on activities that they sent home with them, that these kids could do at home on their own time and then report back to us, kind of have a wrap around and tell us what they were doing. So we left them every day to document what they were doing and then show us the next day, send us pictures that put in a shared Google slide. So our daily topics, we talked about what is archaeology? What do archaeologists do? How can archaeologists learn about the past? And then on Thursday, a local and statewide historical archaeology, where we invited kids to come to the Historical Society outside in a socially distanced way to have some hands-on activities and get to meet us in person. We put together dig boxes and shoe boxes to take home for the kids. I broke some ceramics that I bought at the thrift store for 50 cents a pop. My kids actually love that part. No, you know, it's not every day that you get to break ceramics on purpose to help your mom out doing her job. It was a lot of fun. So day one, we talked about what is archaeology. I had the kids do the chocolate chip cookie excavation. If you're ever engaging with young people and you want to do something like this, it's a lot of fun. You have to take a hard chocolate chip cookie like Chips Ahoy, and you have them excavate out the chips with a toothpick. We had them looking at soil in their backyards. They go outside and look at your soil, feel some soil, feel its difference, look at its color, kind of really thinking about what soil is as opposed, you know, not just the dirt you see in your backyard. And then we talked about stratigraphy in your bedroom, which is something that maybe all of us can relate to, right? If you look around your office and your bedrooms, about where things are in the law of superposition in terms of things are on the bottom of the pile of junk in your bedroom floors and things that are on the top. Day two was our dig box, where we had made these boxes and put some objects in there and asked the kids to dig through them and kind of find these objects. We put some of those broken ceramics in there and then provided a baggie with other ceramics, as if maybe they were looking at a lab assemblage to try to figure out how their artifacts fit in with the artifacts they were given separately. Oops. On day three, we talked about the objects that we found in our dig boxes. We also asked kids to think about, were there objects at home that maybe not everybody would realize what they were, again, to talk about how we might understand and contextualize material remains of things. And we did a Native American glyph activity. We weren't copying things, we weren't being appropriative in this case, but talked about some of the Native American glyphs that you can see up here in, I think it's on Kelly's Island and in Northeast Ohio. And then kids were encouraged to make their own glyphs, not to copy, but again, to kind of create their own petroglyphs, if you will, on stones in their backyards. I'm gonna stop sharing this for just a moment to share another screen. I have some of the kids that worked with us. It's gonna take me a moment to find this and pull it back up. Created videos. I think you're seeing it now, right? Can you see my other set of videos?
We are not seeing those.
Shoot, I practiced this a moment ago and it worked just fine. Let me try. Oh, hang on. Oh, I got it. Wait. I told you I'm not a Zoom gal. Now you see it, right?
There you go. Yep.
So the students made please work. A time-lapse video of them excavating out their cookies. With this activity, we also come a piece of graph paper so they can practice mapping and making a map of their cookie and then excavating out and then recording their findings when they're done. So it's kind of cute. Let me come back to my main slides here. Oops. Sorry, back to my main slides now, right? I think.
Yes, yes.
There we go. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And then on day 4, we had a local and statewide history and archaeology day where we invited kids and their families to come for socially distanced activities, including looking at some of my teaching collection of artifacts and objects, including both prehistoric and historic pieces, looking at some of the artifacts that we had excavated from previous iterations of the Shaker dig, and trying our hand at an atlatl throwing, because who doesn't have some awesome reproduction atlatls that they bought at Fort Ancient lying around in their office. Not just me, I bet some of you do too. It was really fun, and we kind of got to also engage and then also show these families, you know, although we couldn't go into the historical museum at the time, that they were welcome to come back with their families when we did open back up. And this was so successful that we were actually able to continue this kind of work online for short, like 1 and 2 day spring and winter break sessions, where we encourage kids to learn about cuneiform, make your own cuneiform tablet, do Munsell testing with paint testers. My colleague Rosemary had the brilliant idea to use those little paint swatches of brown paint that you get for free at Lowe's or Home Depot to simulate what it's like to use a Munsell chart to look at soil colors and to make standard notations about color that way. And we did a little sediment stratigraphy where I had given in advance a little baggie full of different size sediments, sand, gravel, et cetera, and you put them in a bottle with water, shake it up, and then watch it settle out. It was really successful. And in fact, it was so much so that we feel confident that we've been able to reimagine this program in a way that we can move forward in a kind of hybrid way, because with the uncertainty of COVID, even going into the spring, it's not entirely sure how this might work. So what we're hoping to do this summer, and actually we're working on this right now, is to create a large scale simulated excavation on the property of the Shaker Historical Society. So we're not going to dig at a site anymore, but we're going to create a site in raised beds like this that we can allow kids to have this experience in a controlled way that is non-destructive, but also simulates what it's like to do archaeology. We'll run this for a week. We'll do morning only excavations, send kids home with activities to do at home in the afternoons to create a sustainable camp that we think will allow us to engage in public archaeology in the post-COVID world and see us through our next 5 years. We're also even doing another summer camp this year to allow us to investigate some of the history of Shaker Heights. So we'll be running a week-long program with a little bit older kids, like middle school age kids, and we will look at Native Americans in this region, the early Shaker history, the Van Swearingen history, the civil rights movement in Shaker Heights, and kind of tie this all together. And by the way, I'd like to put this shout out. If you've ever done something like this, built a simulated excavated dig box like this, I'd love to talk to you about this afterwards. So I really feel like we're finally in a position where we can say there's going to be a Shaker Dig 7 and hopefully even an 8 and 9 and 10, that we found a model that allows us to continue to engage with young people going forward. And in my final conclusion remarks, I'd like to give a huge shout out to everybody who's helped make this possible, including Shaker Historical Society, Rosemary Nemeth, the City of Shaker Heights, my institution, the Cleveland Institute of Art, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, who also helps to fund some of these larger programs. If you'd like to talk to me more about this, please reach out to me at my email, or you can follow me on Twitter. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Beth. That was a very good presentation. As Kevin mentioned in the chat, if you could share the links to some of the things that you were talking about in your presentation slides, that would be awesome.
Sure, I'll work on that over lunch and I'll put it in when we're done here.
Cool. Then we're going to move on here to our next presentation, which is Kevin Nolan, and the title of his presentation is Newark Earthworks and Virtual World Heritage Ohio, Introduction to a Prototype Multi-Audience Virtual World Experience. So without further ado, Kevin, I turn it over to you.
Okay, are you guys seeing my title slide?
Yes.
All right. This is a really exciting project, at least it's exciting to me, that is a big collaboration, and we are going to be making a interactive virtual world out of the Newark Earthworks that you can explore the site, the earthworks themselves, and a environment that doesn't have buildings on it, but then also can explore the celestial alignments. And I'll have a co-presenter come on later and talk more about that. So I'm going to get through my part. And so a note about the author. So this is, like I said, a collaborative project. So it's everybody that's involved in the project, either part of the project team or our advisory board, which has been very, very helpful, is included as an author here. This is just regurgitating our abstract. I assume everybody knows here what Hopewell is. And this is a prototype project where we're going to develop this first model focusing on Newark, and then hopefully be able to do additional models of additional Hopewell earthworks moving forward into the future. The project is a partnership between the Applied Anthropology Laboratories where I work, the Institute for Digital and Intermedia Arts, or the IDEA Lab, also at Ball State here, and John Philwalk is the director there and the co-PI on the grant. And we also have a couple of folks, Brad Lepper and Jen Altman from the Ohio History Connection on the project, and also collaborating with the Works, a science education center in the area. And the project team, here's a list of all of the folks that are working on this, just the authors and our affiliations. Do want to take a special notice to focus on Jade, our graduate assistant, who will be graduating this weekend with her master's degree in architecture. She did a lot of work on the GIS here and all of the foundational steps for building this model and exporting it to the 3D. So thank you, Jade, for all of your hard work there, and we will miss you in the second year of this project. Then our advisory board members have been participating in regular meetings and providing input about what direction the project is going. And so it's been a very collaborative project. So quick overview of what we're going to cover. And so the overall project, the goal is to develop 3 different interfaces for a virtual environment so people can experience the Newark Earthworks outside of the modern environment, with the buildings and the golf course and everything that's on there, and learn from it in different ways. And so there's a screen-based version, which will be through a PC or a desktop if those still exist in the future. And you can access it online, and it'll be immersive and into a virtual world. Also going to develop this into a mobile platform so you can use it on your phone in a virtual reality, possibly an augmented reality experience where you can see the earthworks as they were, or best we can get to, but then also experience and see the astronomical alignments, not just as they are today, but as they were at the time that the earthworks were constructed. And then we will also be developing this, and this is one of the places where the Works comes in, into a planetarium, a digital planetarium experience, so that we can target K-12 audiences for educational purposes, but also general audiences to share the impressive nature and the knowledge encoded in these earthworks with the general public in a variety of accessible ways without people having to travel there. So for those of you who don't know, this is where the Newark Earthworks is. It's in Newark, and there's a town around it. And you can see up here the golf course, the country club, and that's where the octagon and the circle are, and then the great circle is over here, and then the rest of it expanded around. I'm sure Brad could chime in with something about the size and the length of walls that it's included, but as Jared said, it's one of the largest and most impressive, well-preserved earthwork sites anywhere. So a good one to start with for our prototype. So the process started with with the project team and the advisory board. We identified a bunch of historic sources and maps, and here's most of them, and then we georeferenced them. If you are not aware, all maps have some kind of a projection, a distortion to take three-dimensional globe and turn it into a flat surface. And so even if these maps are accurate on the ground or in the projection that they're made in, they don't necessarily directly translate. They need to be tied to space and corrected for that distortion. And there's kind of a teaser here in the background of our composite map. But so we started off by digitizing the maps and then georeferencing them with multiple control points to get them to conform as best as we could to the ground surface. And then we, from those georeferenced maps, we created shape files, polyline and polygon files to represent the embankments and the mounds and everything else recorded in them. So here you can see a selection of some of the original images, all nice, neat squares and all orderly. And then on the bottom is what they look like when they're georeferenced and images are rectified. And you can see that there are various amounts of distortion brought in. And one of the things that we discovered is several of these maps don't actually connect to each other. The two big parts of the site, the octagon and then the great circle and the complexes coming off of that, they're not mapped in the same, they don't have the same relationships between them. And so, for example, the Atwater map, we had to digitize the east side and the west side separately in order to get something that even remotely matched what was on the ground. That's really hard to do with the Atwater map because it doesn't actually match anything. We had to do the same thing with the Weyrich map as well. What you'll notice, and this was kind of predicted ahead of time, is that the Salisbury draft map 1862 has the smallest amount of distortion in that rectangle after it's been georeferenced. And so that was, when we started, what we expected to be the best, one of the best representations of what it was like, at least in the 19th century. And then here's their, they had a draft map, and then they published the map later, and it was slightly modified in there. And through this process, we learned a lot of things about the decisions that people made in how to represent what was on the ground. And so that's a completely other tangent that I could go down at a later date. But there were some things that were correct in the Salisbury published version that aren't correct in the draft map and vice versa. So we had to combine all of these different things, including some early Dash Reeves aerial images and then some of Brad's later interpretation, specifically this one focusing on the Cherry Valley ellipse. So I'm just going to go through and show what the georeferencing looks like over the modern DEM, so you can still see the streets in here, and Neil will show us later what it looks like when we strip those out. And so this is Atwater. It kind of looks somewhat like there might be something that was there, but overall it didn't get much right. So then moving on to Squire and Davis, this one we should all recognize. Jared just showed us an hour ago or so. That's what it looks like, fit as best as we can to the ground. And one thing you'll notice is that once we got the best georeferencing that we could, we digitized the lines where they were. And so you can see here, you can see the DEM, the elevation model behind it has the actual embankment here, and the embankment that we were able to digitize doesn't match that. And so even we couldn't eliminate all the distortions in each of these maps. So here's the Weyrich map, then the Salisbury draft map, the Salisbury published map, and this is from some of the aerial photographs, and then here is Lepper and Hancock's interpretation of the Cherry Valley ellipse, a composite interpretation there. And so this is my favorite end product that we've gotten so far. If I was I would be happy to stop here. This is a great map. I really like this. It shows the overall variability in how it was represented and the different errors built in. And you can see this blue line's heading up here. Atwater, I don't know what Atwater was doing. So you can see that they're all generally in the same place once you add that distortion in. But there are some significant differences. So if you're looking for alignments that are significant, these angle differences in those roads and the orientations of the different enclosures, those matter. And if you haven't done a detailed georeferencing and applying that projection distortion to the map to put it onto the ground before looking at your alignments, you're going to get something wrong. So then once we had all of those, we have now developed our single best interpretation that we're calling our consensus map. And it is mostly based on the Salisbury maps, but adding in some things. Particularly, there are enclosures or mounds that weren't mapped on the Salisbury maps that are mapped on some of the other ones. And then the Cherry Valley ellipse interpretation. So this is our consensus model. And here's a link. The first step here is we put this up on ArcGIS Online. And so you can see we've got this public map that's available that you can look at all of the layers there, and you can turn them on and off as you want to. And then we've got a web application that you can also use to look at our consensus model, and this is the link that was in the presentation, and I'll post these links also in the chat later for those who are interested. But this is what we're working on, and these lines will then go over to the virtual world 3D modeling team, and they'll be creating this, and then we'll be able to look at the alignments. And so I will stop sharing so that we can, oops, maybe I will stop sharing, I don't know. It's not letting me stop sharing. Don't they show references? Are you guys still seeing my screen?
Yeah, we're seeing a lovely sunset or sunrise.
Oh boy. I have never had this happen before. How do I? Oh, there.
Oh, well,
There we go.
just as you discovered it, I also discovered I could stop you sharing as a co-host. So.
Okay, so now we should be ready. Neil is on here. If you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Sure. Is that coming through?
Yes.
It is.
Okay, so my name's Neil Zara. I have a 3D modeling background with Idea Lab, and I've kind of go through some of the steps from going from the elevation data to the final simulation. So we start out loading the different tiles of data of interest from the Ohio website. Then we load those into a software called Terragen, which is a 3D landscape rendering and modeling application. So this can represent a whole sphere, a whole planet, and depending on the radius you use, it can reference Earth or Mars or the Moon. So it's very useful that way, and you can geolocate elevation data onto this planet. So all the different tiles of data we downloaded, we georeferenced into a grid of interest, and then centered our camera over this data to show all of the information. So then from here, we can export a 3D model out of that into our modeling application. In this case, this is a case around the area of interest here. You can see the earthworks that remain and all the streets around it. This comes out to about a 21 million triangle based model here. So we try to gather as much of the data as we can into 3D space. And the next step would be to clear out the modern features. So we want to represent it as it may have been back in the day. So first we go into a sculpting application. So we try and flatten and smooth out the modern features, the highways, the streets, that sort of thing. And then try and naturalize it a little bit, so that add in a little natural noise pattern to make it more natural. And then the next step will be to bring in the consensus lines that Kevin talked about and to recreate what's been lost and to kind of reinforce these pieces and align them with the terrain. And then from there, we can bring it into our game engine to make the live simulation. We can add our textures, our lighting, trees, that sort of thing. And this point, we add in solar and lunar rotational data that we download from the NASA JPL Horizons database. So we gather a list of azimuth and elevation positions for the sun and the moon every hour for years of interest. And then the game engine can track that position of the sun and the moon and display those with real-time shadows over the 3D model in the game engine. So if there's a certain point of interest you want to track with lunar alignments or solar alignments, you can plug in the date and visualize it that way. And John, I know you're on the call as well. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, so I'm John Philwalk. I head up the Idea Lab, and working with Kevin and his team on this. We created this prototype you're seeing here pretty early on. This was before we had the data from Kevin, and kind of in the midterm there too. We did go through the process of what Neil just outlined of creating the Terrigen 3D map out of the LiDAR data from the state, which was pretty good resolution. And Neil, do you remember the resolution on the LiDAR data that we obtained?
That's a good question. I know that it comes in 5,000 square feet chunks.
Yeah, I forget it was half meter, but in any case, it was quite good. And you know, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that process, but essentially at that point, you know, it's capturing everything it sees. So it sees trees and buildings and all that, but then there's a bare earth process where it scrapes that data out, but it does leave that imprint that Neil just showed earlier. So little kind of small elevation shifts. So you can still see imprints of roads and sidewalks and curbs and things like that. So that's where more of the interpretation and artistry comes in. We have to make sure, we have to be sensitive to any, you know, extant features. So there is a, outside of the main features that you see, the octagon and the two circles, there's a little bit of a remnant. And I don't know, Neil, maybe we can show it. Yeah, there you go. So that little exciting angle there is one of the few other outliers. But it's important because, as Kevin was mentioning, you know, the surveys for each of the main sites are pretty accurate, but the relationship between the main features are not. And so this becomes an important registration point for us. And I don't know, Neil, can you show maybe what would be the best way to show that? Maybe the Google satellite view. I don't know if you have that at your fingertips or not, but
I can load it up.
But it's a little bit of a remnant of the square that appears like a diamond because it's at an angle, but it's outside of a current welding shop, and it's just sitting out there, just a little fragment of, you know, that they apparently didn't bulldoze over. But it's going to be very helpful in rectifying the relationship between the main sites and also correlating the consensus map that Kevin showed. And so we're looking at that right now. Yeah, that's the general location. So if you see those red trucks, if he zooms in just a little bit more, if it's possible, maybe not. Yeah, there you go. You can see that. And we first thought that that was a corner of the square, but actually it's not. Neil was looking at this a little further, and you want to show what portion of the square that actually is? It's actually it is partially a corner, but it does have, instead of being an actual corner of only the square, it's actually one side of the square and one side of an embankment on one of the avenues. So it took us a little bit to figure that out. But if you show maybe, Kevin's map or something, you can kind of hover over that intersection. So that was kind of exciting. So we haven't told Kevin about that too, but we have to work on that a little more, I think, in rectifying that. So that'll be the next step. And then once we take that, there we go. So this is a map that's apparently on site, and it shows what that embankment actually is. And we misread it as the western side of that diamond-oriented square at first, but it's actually part of a embankment on an avenue, and then a side of the square. So that was interesting to randomly discover. It'd be great to get out there and walk the site and see if there are other features that are just there. Brad, who's also on the project, pointed out a residence that's to the north that also has a section of one of the earthworks. So that was also interesting. So, well, there's not much left in that regard, in sort of all the connecting features. So that makes it a little tricky. So, but I think, what's next for us is then we'll do so here's the state, what we call the state model. And then we're going toward, well, actually the cleaned up version that Neil was showing earlier. It's really more the kind of the state model. And then what we'll do is we'll start to create the restoration model, which we did show a little a draft of that a few minutes ago in Unity, which does get toward the recreation of it. And then once we're in that environment, this is Unity, the game engine of Unity, there'll be little preset nodes. So known or suspected observation points will be dropped in, so you can very quickly orient yourself perhaps to a lunar, northernmost sunrise or sunset or moonrise or moonset, that kind of thing, those kind of alignments. There are a lot of lunar alignments that are known or suspected more than solar. So we'll be doing a lot of that as a observational preset, which is kind of fun. So there's a nice, this was the last known moonrise event. What I think, Kevin, was it 2006? Yeah, I guess it says it right there, 2006. So that's where we're heading with this. We've worked with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to develop a process with the game engine where you can either do a live call from the game engine to their ephemeris table. They have, I think they track about 10,000 objects. We usually are only interested in visible objects, so the sun, the moon, and the visible planets, comets, things like that, in these sort of archaeological simulations. But yeah, that data can be brought in, and then those objects represented virtually in the environment, and then with the user interface, it's very simple to kind of put in any kind of known solstice or equinox event, or maybe with other cultures, perhaps feast days, that kind of thing. So you can see if there are kind of significant alignments. Perhaps there is a bit of a wobble to the Earth, so there's always a bit of a difference, depending on how far back a site was created. If there's an alignment back then as opposed to today. When we worked on Stonehenge, there's kind of since it's quite old, there are quite a bit of difference there in that case in terms of the alignments, but more newer sites like this, perhaps maybe not as much. So, but still significant. So it's interesting to then correct for that and then create the observation. So I think that's where we're at. We're just working, like I said, with Kevin with getting the map data, and from there, then the next step is to model this out fully in a restoration state. I'll turn it back over to Kevin at this point.
So that's our first public introduction of the Virtual World Heritage Ohio project. We're done like 2 minutes early. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, I posted the links to the ArcGIS Online resources in the chat. And I also saw that Elizabeth posted her some of her stuff in the chat as well. So I think that's it. We can be done with our presentation. I'll turn it back over to Eric.
Okay, thank you so much, guys, on that interesting presentation. Yeah, so now we are, I guess this is the lunch session. So a few things I wanted to note before you guys disperse to use the bathroom and grab a bite to eat and whatnot. We have a couple of virtual posters that you will be able to view. I'm going to post links to them in the chat, but they're also on the OAC news page for reference. We've got 2 links. You can find both of them on the first link, which is Padlet. It's basically, like I said, a virtual bulletin board with the poster presentations on them. I'm one of the poster presenters, as is Kevin Schwartz. So both of us will be available over the next hour to answer any questions you might have. This is also an opportunity for everyone to ask questions that they might have had about any of the presentations that you've seen. So for the panelists, for Beth, for Kevin, for Jared, and anyone else who's presented, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I'm still going to leave the live stream going on YouTube. So just keep that in mind if you unmute yourself or, or anything like that. We can open up breakout sessions if necessary, but at this time we're taking our lunch break, and then we'll start back up at 1 p.m. with Jeb Bowen and his presentation. And until then, take your break if you need it. And I'm going to take my quick break, probably 5 minutes, and then I'll be back to answer any questions that people might have.